Get him off this plane now. The command didn't echo. It sliced through the cabin, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sentence that didn't ask for permission, only compliance. And for a moment, everything inside first class froze mid-breath. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. Conversations cut short like someone had pulled the plug on sound itself. Because every eye turned toward seat 2A where a man in a plain black t-shirt and dark jeans sat without moving, without reacting, as if the words hadn't been meant for him at all. But they were, and everyone knew it, especially the two security officers now standing in the aisle, their presence heavy, their posture firm, their attention locked on him like he was the disruption, like he was the problem that needed to be removed before the plane ever left the ground. And still he didn't move, didn't argue, didn't even raise his voice. He just looked up slowly, calm, steady, the kind of calm that didn't match the situation, the kind that made people uncomfortable. Because it suggested something deeper, something unseen, something they hadn't accounted for. And that's when one of the officers reached out, not aggressively, not violently, but firmly enough to make a statement, enough to signal to everyone watching that this wasn't a request anymore. It was procedure, and somewhere behind them a flight attendant crossed her arms and muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Sir, you're not authorized to be in this section." Her tone flat, rehearsed, the kind. A voice that had said this before, the kind that believed it was justified. And still the man didn't flinch, didn't rise, didn't defend himself the way most people would when confronted like this in public. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the tension build, like he was measuring something invisible, something no one else in that cabin could see yet. And it made the moment heavier, thicker, like the air itself had slowed down just to watch what would happen next. Because this wasn't just about a seat anymore. It wasn't just about policy or boarding zones or who belonged where. It was about perception, about assumption, about the quiet, unspoken rules people enforced without ever saying them out loud. And right now those rules were playing out in real time in front of a full cabin of witnesses who didn't yet realize they were part of something bigger than a flight delay. And as the second officer stepped closer, his voice lower, more direct, "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us." The man finally spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. "You might want to check that again." And the words didn't challenge, they didn't provoke, they simply existed, calm and precise, like a fact waiting to be acknowledged. But instead of checking, instead of pausing, the crew doubled down, because sometimes authority doesn't like being questioned, especially not quietly, especially not by someone who doesn't fit the image they expect. And somewhere behind the row a young trainee flight attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking between the man and the tablet in her hand, because she had seen something earlier, something small but important, a green checkmark, a valid scan, a confirmation that didn't match what was happening now. And she opened her mouth slightly, unsure, caught between protocol and truth, while across the aisle a passenger slowly raised his phone, not to make a scene, not yet, but because something about this felt wrong. Not loud wrong, not obvious wrong, but subtle, familiar, the kind of wrong that hides behind policy and tone and justifications that sound reasonable until you look closer. And still the man remained seated, hands resting lightly, posture relaxed, as if the chaos forming around him didn't belong to him at all, as if he was watching it unfold from somewhere above the moment rather than inside it. And that calm began to ripple through the cabin, confusing people, shifting the energy in ways no one could quite explain, because people expect resistance in moments like this. They expect anger, fear, defensiveness, something that confirms the narrative already forming in their heads. But he gave them none of that. And without it, the situation lost its script. It lost its clarity. It became something unstable, something unpredictable. And that's when the trainee finally spoke, her voice hesitant but real. I think his ticket scanned." And for a second, just 1 second, the entire sequence faltered, like a glitch in the system, like reality itself paused to reconsider what it was doing. But hesitation doesn't always win against momentum, and the senior attendant stepped in quickly, cutting her off with a look that said not now, not here, not him, and turned back toward the man with a firmer tone. "Sir, if you don't comply, we will have to remove you from the aircraft." And there it was, the escalation. The line crossed from suggestion to consequence, from inconvenience to removal. And still Still, he didn't move, didn't react the way they expected. Instead, he reached slowly into his pocket, not in a threatening way, not abruptly, just deliberately. Like every movement had already been decided long before this moment ever happened. And as he pulled out his phone, the cabin leaned in without realizing it, curiosity overtaking judgment for the first time. Because something about this didn't feel like the end of a story, it felt like the beginning of one, and he glanced at the screen briefly before speaking again, his voice just as calm as before, just as controlled. "You might want to stop." And the sentence hung there, suspended, not loud enough to command attention, but heavy enough that it drew it anyway, because it didn't sound like a plea. It didn't sound like a warning either. It sounded like a statement, like something already in motion that no one else had noticed yet. And for the first time, the confidence on the crew's faces shifted, just slightly, just enough to crack the surface, because confidence built on assumption is fragile, and all it takes is one moment, one sentence, one unexpected response to expose how thin it really is. And as the officer closest to him hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the man looked up again, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that didn't match the situation at all, and said quietly, almost casually, "Before you make this your final decision, you might want to check who you're removing." And something about the way he said it changed the room, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough that people felt it, enough that the energy shifted from certainty to doubt, from authority to hesitation, and in that space, in that thin crack between action and consequence, the entire story began to turn, because this was never just about a seat, and deep down, somewhere beneath the uniforms and the procedures and the assumptions, they were starting to realize it. The hesitation did not last long, but it lasted long enough to change everything, because once doubt enters a room built on certainty, it does not leave. Quietly, it spreads, subtle and persistent, and now it was moving through the cabin like a quiet current, passing from one passenger to another, from one crew member to the next, and the man at the center of it all remained exactly where he had been, seated, composed, untouched by the urgency that surrounded him, as if he had already stepped outside the moment while everyone else was still trapped inside it. And the first officer shifted his stance slightly, his grip loosening just enough to signal uncertainty, not surrender, but reconsideration, and that small shift did not go unnoticed, not by the trainee standing near the galley, not by the passenger holding his phone a little higher now, and certainly not by the senior attendant whose expression tightened as she realized the situation was no longer moving in a straight line. "Sir," she said again, her voice sharper this time, trying to pull control back into her hands, "we are following procedure." But the words did not land the same way anymore, because procedure only works when everyone believes in it, and belief was beginning to crack, and the man looked at her calmly, his eyes steady, not challenging, not pleading, just present, and that presence carried a weight she could not easily dismiss. "Then follow it completely," he replied, his tone even, measured. "Not just the part that makes you comfortable." And the sentence hung there, quiet but undeniable, because it did not accuse, it revealed, and that made it harder to ignore. And for a brief moment no one spoke, not the officers, not the crew, not even the passengers, because something had shifted from action to awareness, and awareness is harder to control than action. And the trainee took a step forward before she could stop herself, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the silence. "His name was in the system," she said, her hands tightening slightly around the tablet she held. "I saw it earlier." And the words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward, because now it was no longer just one man against authority. It was a second voice, a witness, and witnesses change everything. And the senior attendant turned toward her quickly, her expression controlled but her eyes sharp. "You are not part of this escalation," she said, each word clipped, deliberate, but the trainee did not step back this time, did not retreat the way she might have 10 minutes ago, because something about the situation had moved beyond hierarchy, beyond roles and titles, into something simpler, something harder to deny, right and wrong. And once that line becomes visible, it is difficult to unsee it. And across the aisle the passenger who had been recording spoke quietly to no one in particular. He has not raised his voice once. And the observation, simple as it was, carried weight, because It forced the room to confront the contrast between behavior and response, between calm and escalation. And that contrast made the situation feel uneven, unbalanced, like something was off, and the officer closest to the man exhaled slowly, his posture shifting again, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid. "Sir," he said, this time less forceful, more measured. "We just need to verify a few things." And that was the first real change, not in words, but in tone, because tone reveals intention. And intention had just shifted from removal to reconsideration, and the senior attendant noticed it immediately, her jaw tightening as she stepped forward, trying to reclaim control before it slipped any further. "There is nothing to verify," she said firmly. "There is no record of him in this cabin." And for a moment that statement tried to reset the narrative, tried to restore certainty. But certainty built on denial is fragile, and the trainee shook her head slightly, almost instinctively. "There was," she said again, quieter now, but no less certain. "It showed green." And that word, green, simple, technical, undeniable, cut deeper than any argument could have, because it pointed to something objective, something recorded, something that should not be easily dismissed, and the man watched the exchange without interrupting, without inserting himself into it, as if he understood that the moment no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the room, to the people inside it who were now beginning to question what they were seeing and what they were being told. And that shift, that slow movement from blind acceptance to active observation, was where real change begins, not loud, not dramatic, but steady. And he glanced down at his phone briefly, his expression unchanged, then back up at the officer. "You see it now, do you not?" he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of what was already happening. And the officer hesitated, not because he had an answer, but because he no longer had certainty. And uncertainty in a position of authority is dangerous, because it forces you to choose between doubling down or stepping back, and neither option feels safe. And around them the cabin continued to shift, passengers leaning slightly forward, conversations replaced by quiet observation, the kind that builds pressure without noise. And the senior attendant took a breath, steadying herself. "We are not delaying this flight over confusion," she said, her voice firm again, trying to anchor the moment. But the word confusion did not land the way she intended, because confusion suggests uncertainty on both sides, and that was no longer true. One side was becoming clearer, the other more strained, and the man's voice came again, calm as ever, cutting clean through the tension. "This is not confusion," he said. "This is a decision." And the sentence settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, because it reframed everything. It stripped away the excuses, the language, the layers, and reduced the moment to what it truly was, a choice. And choices carry consequences, whether acknowledged or not. And for the first time since the situation began, the senior attendant did not respond immediately, because somewhere beneath the surface, she understood that the next move would not just resolve the moment, it would define it. And the man remained still, composed, watching not with defiance, but with patience, the kind of patience that does not come from uncertainty, but from knowing exactly what comes next. The word decision did not fade after it was spoken. It settled into the cabin like something permanent, something that could not be undone once acknowledged. And for a moment no one moved, because everyone understood, even if they could not yet admit it, that whatever happened next would define more than just this flight. It would define them. And the senior attendant felt it first, that shift from control to exposure, because authority only works when it is unquestioned, and now it was being questioned in real time, not by defiance, but by clarity, and clarity is harder to silence. So she did what people often do when certainty begins to slip. She reached for the system, for something concrete, something that could re-establish control. "Check the manifest." "Again," she said sharply, turning toward the trainee, her voice no longer dismissive but directive, because now she needed confirmation, needed the system to support her, to restore the narrative she had already committed to. And the trainee hesitated for only a fraction of a second before tapping the screen, her fingers moving quickly, almost too quickly, like she was trying to catch something before it disappeared again. And the cabin leaned in without realizing it, every small movement now carrying weight, every glance toward that screen feeling like it mattered more than it should. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly. It appears quietly on a screen, waiting for someone to acknowledge it. And as the trainee scanned through the list, her brow furrowed slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "It is not here," she said slowly, her voice uncertain now, not because she doubted what she had seen earlier, but because it was no longer there, and that absence hit the room differently than denial had. Because absence suggests change, and change suggests intent, and the senior attendant seized on it immediately, stepping forward, her confidence returning just enough to fill the space. "There it is," she said, almost with relief. "No record, which means he does not belong in this cabin." And for a moment it sounded convincing again, because systems are trusted, screens are believed, and when something is not there, people assume it was never there to begin with. But the trainee did not move, did not lower the tablet, because something about that explanation did not sit right, not after what she had seen, not after the certainty she had felt earlier when the green confirmation appeared, and she shook her head slightly, more to herself than anyone else. "It was there," she repeated, softer now, but still firm, and the words did not challenge authority directly, but they lingered long enough to keep doubt alive, and doubt, once planted, does not need to be loud to be powerful. And across the aisle the passenger with the phone spoke again, his voice calm but steady. "So his name just disappeared." And the question was simple, almost casual, but it cut through the situation with precision, because it exposed the inconsistency without accusing anyone outright. And inconsistency is where narratives begin to unravel, and the officer closest to the man glanced toward the tablet. Then back at the man himself, his expression no longer rigid, no longer certain, because now he was not just following orders, he was observing, and observation changes everything, and the man, still seated, still composed, watched it all unfold with the same quiet patience, as if he had seen this pattern before, as if this moment was not new to him, just another variation of something familiar. And he spoke again, not to the crew, not to the officers, but to the room itself, his voice low but clear. "Systems do not erase people," he said. "People erase people." And the sentence landed with a different kind of weight, because it shifted the focus away from technology, away from policy, and placed it directly on human choice, on intention. And that made it harder to hide behind process, harder to pretend this was just confusion or error. And the senior attendant's expression tightened again, not because she had an answer, but because the question had changed, and questions are dangerous when they move from what happened to why it happened. And for a moment she said nothing, because anything she said now would have to address that shift, would have to confront the implication behind his words. And the silence stretched just long enough for the tension to deepen, just long enough for the cabin to feel it, that subtle shift from routine to something else, something heavier, something that could not be easily resolved with a simple instruction or a firm tone. And the trainee looked down at the tablet again, scrolling, searching, as if the truth might reappear if she looked hard enough. And then she stopped, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There is a gap," she said quietly, almost to herself, but the words carried, because the cabin was listening now, fully, completely. "Seat 2A, it is blank." And that detail, small as it was, changed everything, because a blank space is not the same as a missing entry. A blank space suggests something was there before, something that has been removed. And the passenger with the phone let out a quiet breath. "So someone cleared it," he said, not accusing, not loud, just stating what now seemed obvious. And the officer's posture shifted again, his stance no longer aligned with immediate action, but with hesitation, with reconsideration. And the man in the seat looked at him, meeting his eyes with that same calm presence, and said, "Now you see it." And it was not a question, it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the shift that had already happened, because the moment had moved beyond assumption, beyond appearance, into something factual, something observable. And once that line is crossed, it is difficult to return to ignorance. And the senior attendant took a step back, just one, but enough to signal that control was no longer absolute, that the situation had moved beyond her ability to dictate it entirely. And for the first time since the command had been given, the room did not feel like it belonged to authority. It felt like it belonged to the truth that was slowly, quietly, making its way to the surface. The blank space did not just sit on the screen, it echoed, louder than any accusation, louder than any raised voice could have been, because it was proof without speaking, absence with intention, and once the cabin saw it, once that single detail settled into everyone's awareness, the energy shifted again, deeper this time, more permanent, because now it was no longer about what people thought they saw. It was about what had clearly been altered, and that realization carried weight that no policy could easily explain away, and the senior attendant felt it slipping through her fingers, control, certainty, authority, all of it thinning in real time, and she straightened her posture as if posture alone could restore it, as if standing firmer would somehow stabilize what was already unraveling. "That does not prove anything," she said, her voice steady but strained at the edges, because she knew, even as she spoke, that the room was no longer fully with her, and once a room stops believing, authority becomes performance, and performance is fragile, and the officer closest to the aisle glanced again at the tablet, then at the empty seat marker, then back at the man, his eyes no longer searching for confirmation but for understanding, because something about this no longer aligned with the simple narrative he had been given, and simple narratives are easy to follow, but they fall apart when reality becomes layered, and the man watched all of this without urgency, without frustration, as if time itself had slowed down around him, as if he was allowing the moment to reach its own conclusion without forcing it, and that patience, that refusal to rush, created pressure in a different way, a quiet pressure that built not from action, but from inevitability, and across the aisle the passenger lowered his phone slightly, not because the moment was over, but because it had become something else, something more than just a clip or a scene. It had become a turning point. And people recognize turning points even if they cannot yet name them, and the trainee swallowed softly, her grip on the tablet tightening as she spoke again, this time with more certainty. "The log shows it was edited," she said, her voice steadier now, grounded in what she was seeing. "There is a timestamp, recent." And the word recent did not need explanation. It carried implication all on its own, because recent means intentional. Recent means someone made a decision not long ago, and that realization moved through the cabin like a wave, subtle but undeniable, and the officer's posture shifted. Again, this time not toward enforcement, but toward pause, because enforcement requires clarity, and clarity had just been replaced by contradiction, and the senior attendant took a step forward, her voice rising slightly, not loud, but sharper. "That system updates constantly," she said quickly. That does not mean anything was changed, but the speed of her response betrayed something, not guilt, not necessarily, but urgency, and urgency without explanation often raises more questions than it answers, and the man's gaze remained steady, his expression unchanged, as if he had expected this exact moment, this exact defense, this exact shift from certainty to explanation, and he spoke again, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to clarify. "Then show them," he said simply, and the simplicity of the request made it impossible to ignore, because it was not a demand, it was an invitation to transparency, and transparency is uncomfortable when something has been hidden, and for a moment no one moved, because showing something means revealing it, and revealing it means accepting what it contains, and the trainee looked at the senior attendant, waiting, not for permission, but for direction, because direction would define what happened next, and the senior attendant hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the room to notice, enough for the doubt to deepen. And that hesitation said more than any explanation could have, because people rarely hesitate when the truth is simple, and the officer noticed it too, his expression tightening slightly as he turned back toward the man, not with suspicion, but with something closer to concern. Because now the situation was no longer about removing a passenger, it was about understanding why that removal had been initiated in the first place, and the man, still seated, still composed, leaned back just slightly, not in defiance, but in ease, as if the tension around him no longer applied to him at all, and that contrast between his calm and their uncertainty continued to widen, making the imbalance more visible with every passing second. And somewhere in the cabin a quiet voice spoke, almost a whisper, "This is not right." And the words did not need to be loud to matter, because they reflected what many were beginning to feel, and once that feeling becomes shared, it becomes harder to suppress, and the senior attendant exhaled. Slowly, her shoulders tightening as she realized the situation had moved beyond control, beyond simple correction, into something that would require explanation. And explanation is where authority is tested, because it forces you to justify what you have already done, and justification is difficult when the foundation is unstable. And the man glanced once more at his phone, then back at the room, his voice calm, precise. "You still have time to correct this," he said, and the sentence did not carry threat, it carried opportunity, the kind of opportunity that appears just before consequence. And the weight of it settled into the cabin, because everyone understood, even if they did not yet fully grasp how, that whatever came next would not just resolve the moment, it would define everything that followed. The word correct did not fade after it was spoken. It lingered, pressing against the edges of the moment like a quiet countdown no one had agreed to but everyone could feel. And for a brief second the entire cabin seemed suspended between two outcomes. One where everything continued as planned, where authority pushed forward and the man was escorted off the plane like an inconvenience removed, and another where something stopped, shifted, recalibrated, and acknowledged what was unfolding in front of them. And that space between those two outcomes grew heavier with every second that passed without action, and the senior attendant felt it tightening around her. Not visible, not spoken, but undeniable, because the longer she waited, the more control she lost, and control, once lost, does not return easily. So she moved, quickly, decisively, stepping toward the aisle with a renewed firmness in her tone. "We are not reversing this process," she said, her voice clear, projecting authority back into the space as if volume alone could restore it. "Sir, you will need to comply so we can proceed with departure." And the sentence was structured to sound final, to sound like the decision had already been made, but something in the room resisted it now, not loudly, not openly, but enough that it did not land the way it would have moments earlier, and the officer nearest to her did not move immediately this time, did not reach again, did not enforce, because enforcement requires certainty, and certainty had been replaced by awareness. And awareness makes action slower, more deliberate, and sometimes it stops it altogether. And he glanced at her briefly, just a fraction of a second, but long enough to signal that he was no longer fully aligned with the direction being pushed forward, and that glance did not go unnoticed, not by the trainee, not by the passengers, and certainly not by the man still seated, who observed it all with the same steady calm that had defined him since the moment the command was first given. And that calm was beginning to change the room in ways no one could fully control, because calm in the face of escalation creates contrast, and contrast creates doubt, and doubt spreads. And across the aisle the passenger who had been recording lowered his phone completely now, not because the moment was over, but because it had become something else, something more than content, something that required attention rather than documentation. And he spoke quietly, his voice steady. "If the system shows a change, then something changed." And the simplicity of the statement carried weight because it did not argue, it did not accuse, it simply connected the pieces that were already visible. And the trainee nodded slightly, almost instinctively, because the logic was undeniable, and logic has a way of cutting through confusion when emotion and authority begin to blur the situation. And the senior attendant turned toward them sharply, her composure tightening. "This is not a discussion," she said, her voice firm again. But the firmness now carried a different energy, less control, more insistence, and insistence often appears when control is already slipping. And the man finally shifted slightly in his seat, not standing, not resisting, just adjusting his posture as if preparing for something that had already been decided in his mind long before anyone else reached the same conclusion. And he looked at the officer again, meeting his eyes with a calm that did not challenge, but invited. "You are still deciding," he said quietly, and the sentence did not accuse, it acknowledged, it recognized the hesitation that had already taken hold. And recognition is powerful because it validates what someone is feeling without forcing them to admit it. And the officer exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing just enough to show that he was no longer operating on automatic, no longer simply following the initial command, but actually considering the situation in front of him. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked a turning point, Because once someone in a position of authority begins to think independently, the structure around them begins to loosen, and the senior attendant saw it, felt it, and understood immediately that she was losing the momentum that had driven the situation from the start. And momentum, once broken, is difficult to rebuild, so she stepped closer again, her voice tightening. "We are delaying the entire flight," she said, redirecting the narrative, shifting the focus away from the man and onto the inconvenience, onto the collective impact, because pressure from the group can sometimes override individual doubt. And for a moment it worked. The cabin stirred slightly, passengers shifting in their seats, glancing at watches, recalibrating their attention, because delay is tangible, delay is immediate, and it affects everyone. But even that shift did not fully take hold, because the foundation of the situation had already been exposed, and once exposed, it does not easily disappear. And the man's voice came again, calm, precise, cutting cleanly through the noise. "This is not about delay," he said. "This is about decision." And the repetition of the word grounded the moment again, pulling it back to its core, stripping away the distractions, the redirection, the attempts to reframe what was happening, and placing it exactly where it belonged, on choice, on responsibility, and on consequence, and the weight of. That word settled again into the cabin, deeper this time, because now it had been reinforced, repeated, anchored, and the officer nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if something had finally aligned in his mind, as if the situation had reached a point where it could no longer be treated as routine. And the trainee looked up from the tablet, her voice steadier than before. "There is a log of who made the change," she said, and the sentence shifted the room once more, because now it was no longer about what happened, it was about who did it. And accountability changes everything, because it transforms a situation from abstract to personal, from procedural to intentional. And the senior attendant's expression tightened again, just enough to reveal that she understood the implication, understood where the moment was heading, and for the first time since the command had been given, she did not respond immediately, because now the room was no longer waiting for her to lead, it was waiting for the truth to surface. And the man remained still, composed, watching as the final layer of the situation began to unfold, knowing, without needing to say it, that the moment had already passed the point where it could be controlled, and was now moving steadily toward where it would be revealed. The word "who" did not just introduce a new layer, it shifted the entire direction of the moment, because questions about what can be explained, but questions about who demand accountability, and accountability is weight that cannot be easily redirected. And as the trainee's words settled into the cabin, every eye moved back to the tablet, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of expectation, because now there was something to uncover, something specific, something that could not be brushed aside with tone or authority. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with the quiet anticipation of a truth that was about to surface whether anyone was ready for it or not. And the senior attendant felt it immediately, that shift from control to exposure. And for the first time since the situation began, her composure did not tighten, it paused, just long enough to reveal that she understood exactly what was at stake. Because once a name appears, the narrative changes. It moves from general to personal, from policy to decision, and decisions belong to people, not systems, and people can be questioned. And the trainee hesitated only briefly before tapping again, her fingers slower now, more deliberate, as if she understood that whatever she revealed next would not just clarify the situation, it would define it. And the screen reflected faintly in her eyes as she read, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly, not shock, not surprise, but recognition. And that recognition was enough to send another ripple through the cabin, because people notice when someone sees something they were not expecting, and the officer closest to her leaned slightly forward, not to take control, but to see for himself, because now this was no longer about enforcing a command. It was about understanding a situation that had already gone beyond routine. And the man remained still, watching, not with urgency, not with anticipation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already knows how the moment ends. And that certainty created a contrast that continued to grow, because everyone else was still catching up, still processing, still trying to piece together what had already become clear to him long ago. And the trainee finally spoke, her voice steady but softer now, as if the words themselves carried weight. "There is an administrative override," she said, and the phrase hung in the air, technical but significant, because overrides are not automatic. They are intentional. They require access, authority, and decision, and that single phrase shifted the focus again, because now the question was no longer whether something had changed. It was who had the authority to change it, and why they chose to do so. And the senior attendant's expression tightened again, but this time it was different, less about maintaining control, more about containing what was already beginning to surface. "System adjustments happen," she said quickly, her tone measured but controlled. "That does not indicate anything improper." But the explanation did not land the way she intended, because the room had already moved past general statements. It was now focused on specifics, on details, on the kind of clarity that cannot be softened with language, and the officer's gaze remained on the screen for a moment longer before shifting back to her. Not confrontational, not accusatory, but questioning, and that question did not need to be spoken, because it was already understood, and across the aisle the passenger spoke again, quieter. This time, but more certain. "Overrides have names," he said, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the explanation like a clean line. Because it removed the abstraction, it pointed directly to the next step, the next piece of truth waiting to be acknowledged, and the trainee nodded slightly, almost instinctively, because she knew it was true, because the system was built that way, because every action leaves a trace, and every trace leads somewhere, and she hesitated again, just for a moment. Not because she did not know what to do, but because she understood what it would mean to do it, and the cabin waited, not impatiently, not loudly, but completely, fully, because now everyone was invested, not in the outcome of a seat assignment, but in the truth behind it, and the man's voice came again, calm, precise, guiding the moment without controlling it. "Go ahead," he said, and the words were not a command. They were permission, the kind that removes hesitation, the kind that makes it easier to act when the weight of the action feels heavy. And the trainee took a small breath, her fingers moving once more, slower now, deliberate, as if each tap carried consequence, and the screen shifted again, details aligning, information revealing itself piece by piece, and then she stopped, her eyes settling on a single line, and for a second she did not speak, because sometimes seeing something and saying it are two different things, especially when what you see changes everything. And the silence stretched, deeper this time, more intentional, because now the room understood that whatever came next would not just clarify the moment, it would redefine it. And the officer leaned slightly closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What does it say?" And the question carried more than curiosity, it carried the weight of responsibility, because once spoken, the information could not be undone. And the trainee lifted her eyes slowly from the screen, her expression no longer uncertain, no longer hesitant, but resolved, because truth, once recognized, demands to be acknowledged. And the man watched her, his gaze steady, unchanged, as if this moment had always been part of the path, as if everything that had happened so far had been leading exactly here. And the cabin held its breath, not literally, but in the way people do when they know they are about to hear something that will shift everything. And the moment hovered there, suspended between silence and revelation, just long enough for everyone to feel it, just long enough for the weight of it to settle before it was finally spoken. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like something under pressure finally giving way. And when the trainee spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not need to, because every person in that cabin was already listening, fully, completely. "It shows the override was initiated from this terminal," she said, her eyes no longer on the screen, but lifting toward the front of the cabin, toward the control panel where the senior attendant had been standing just minutes earlier. And the words did not accuse, they did not point fingers directly, but they connected the line clearly enough that no one needed it explained, and that connection landed harder than any confrontation could have, because it was quiet, factual, undeniable. And for a moment the room did not react, it absorbed. Because sometimes the truth does not cause noise, it causes stillness. And that stillness was heavier than anything that had come before it. Because now the situation had moved beyond confusion, beyond assumption, into something precise, something that could not be reshaped with tone or authority, and the officer nearest the aisle straightened slightly, not in defense, but in awareness, because awareness had now replaced instruction, and instruction without belief does not hold. And he turned his head slowly toward the senior attendant, not aggressively, not accusingly, but with a question that no longer needed to be spoken, because the answer was already present, already visible in the tension that had begun to settle into her posture, in the slight delay before she responded, in the way her confidence no longer filled the space the way it had at the beginning, and she inhaled slowly, as if preparing to reclaim control, but control requires alignment, and alignment had already shifted, and when she spoke, her voice was still firm, but the edges of it carried something new, something thinner. "That does not change the situation," she said, and the sentence was structured to redirect, to move the focus away from the action and back to the outcome. But the room did not follow it this time, because the room had already moved past outcomes. It was focused on cause, on intent, on the decision that had created the situation in the first place, and the man in the seat watched her calmly, his expression unchanged, as if this moment, this exact response, had been expected, and he spoke again, his voice even, steady, cutting cleanly through the space between them. "It changes everything," he said, and the simplicity of the statement gave it weight, because it did not argue, it did not explain, it declared, and declarations shift rooms, especially when they align with what people are already beginning to understand. And across the aisle the passenger who had been watching leaned slightly forward, his voice low but certain. If it came from here, then it was not a mistake. And that was the moment the narrative broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, because once something is no longer seen as a mistake, it becomes a choice. And choices carry responsibility, and responsibility demands response, and the officer nodded once, slowly, not in agreement with any single person, but in acknowledgement of what was now clear, and that acknowledgement marked a shift, subtle but irreversible, because he was no longer acting on instruction, he was acting on understanding, and understanding changes behavior, and the senior attendant felt it, that shift away from her, that movement of authority from command to observation. And for the first time since the moment began, she stepped back, just slightly, but enough to create space between herself and the center of the situation, and space, in moments like this, is revealing, because it shows where control no longer exists, and the trainee lowered the tablet slowly, her role in the moment complete, her voice no longer needed, because the truth had already been placed into the room, and once placed, it does not need repetition, and the man leaned back slightly in his seat, his posture relaxed, not because the tension had disappeared, but because it no longer belonged to him. It had shifted, moved outward, redistributed itself across the room, across the people who now had to process what they had seen and what it meant, and he glanced once more at the officer, his voice calm, measured. "Now you understand," he said, and it was not a question, it was recognition, and recognition is powerful because it validates the shift that has already occurred, and the officer exhaled quietly, his shoulders easing just enough to show that he was no longer in the same position he had been at the start, no longer carrying out a directive without question, but standing in a moment that required something else, something more deliberate, more careful, and the cabin, once tense with anticipation, now held a different kind of energy, not chaos, not confrontation, but clarity, the kind that settles slowly, the kind that changes how people see what is in front of them. And the senior attendant remained still for a moment longer, as if calculating her next move, as if searching for a way to regain control of a situation that had already moved beyond her reach. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, not weak, but measured. "We need to proceed," she said, but the words did not carry the same authority they once had, because authority requires belief, and belief had shifted. And the man's gaze remained steady, his presence unchanged, and he said, quietly, almost gently, "Yes." And then after a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle, "But not the way you planned." And the sentence did not escalate, it did not threaten, it simply redirected, and in that redirection, the entire trajectory of the moment changed, because now the room was no longer moving toward removal, it was moving toward revelation, and everyone could feel it, even if they did not yet fully understand what it would mean. The shift did not explode. It settled, deeper and quieter than before, like something final had already been decided beneath the surface. And for a moment the entire cabin seemed to hold that realization without fully understanding it. Because what had changed was not just the direction of the situation, it was the balance of it. The center of control had moved, not dramatically, not with a declaration, but with a quiet certainty that now belonged to the man still seated in 2A, and he did not move to claim it, did not stand, did not raise his voice, because he did not need to. And that was what made it heavier, because power that does not announce itself is often the most difficult to challenge. And the officer closest to him shifted his stance again, not stepping away, but no longer closing the distance, his posture now neutral, no longer aligned with removal, but with pause. And that pause stretched, creating space where action had once been immediate, and the senior attendant felt it slipping further. That space, that control, and she exhaled slowly before speaking again, her tone more measured now, less forceful. Sir, if there has been a misunderstanding, we can address it after departure. And the sentence was careful, deliberate, an attempt to contain the moment, to move it forward without resolving it, because moving forward is often easier than confronting what is already present. But the man did not accept the shift, not with resistance, but with clarity, and he shook his head slightly, just enough to signal that the moment could not be postponed. This is not something you address later, he said quietly. This is something you acknowledge now. And the words carried weight because they removed the option of delay. They brought everything back to the present, to the decision that had already been made and the consequences that were already forming. And across the aisle the passenger who had been watching spoke again, his voice calm but firm. If it happened here, it gets handled here. And that support, simple as it was, reinforced the shift, because now it was not just one voice. It was a reflection of the room, and the room had begun to align, not loudly, not unanimously, but enough that the direction was clear, and the trainee stood still, her hands now resting at her sides, no longer gripping the tablet tightly. Because her role had changed, she was no longer searching for answers. She had already found them, and now she was witnessing what came next. And the man leaned back slightly, his gaze moving briefly across the cabin, taking in the faces, the expressions, the subtle shifts in posture that revealed more than words ever could. And for a moment, just a moment, his focus turned inward, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that the tension around him seemed to pause, like the world had stepped back for a second to let something else surface, something quieter, something older. And in that stillness, memory moved, not as a distraction, but as context, as something that shaped the way he sat there now, composed, steady, unmoved by the pressure that would have unsettled most people. Because this was not new, not entirely, not in its essence, and the cabin, the seats, the uniforms, they faded slightly in his mind, replaced by a different moment, years earlier, a different flight, a different gate, a younger version of himself standing with a valid ticket in hand, being told to step aside, not because of an error, but because of an assumption, because of a look, because of a judgment made before any fact had been considered. And he remembered the tone, the way it had sounded official, final, unquestionable, and he remembered the feeling, not anger, not at first, but something sharper, something quieter, the realization that he was being evaluated not on what he had, but on what he appeared to be, and that realization had stayed with him, not as a wound, but as a lesson, something he carried forward, something that shaped the way he built, the way he moved, the way he positioned himself in rooms where he was not expected, and now, years later, in a different cabin, in a different seat, that same pattern had emerged again, not identical, but familiar enough that he recognized it immediately, and that recognition was why he remained calm, why he did not react the way they expected, because he had already seen where this path leads, and more importantly, he knew how it ends, and the present returned just as quietly as the memory had come, the cabin coming back into focus, the faces, the tension, the expectation, all of it still there, but now anchored by something deeper, something that gave his calm a different weight, a different meaning. And he looked back at the senior attendant, his voice steady, grounded. You made a decision, he said, and the sentence did not accuse, It clarified. It named what had happened without raising it to conflict. And that clarity made it harder to deflect, harder to reshape. And she held his gaze for a moment, her composure still present, but thinner now, stretched across a situation she could no longer fully control, and she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement that the moment had moved beyond where she intended it to go, and the officer glanced between them, understanding now that this was no longer about enforcing a directive, but about resolving a decision that had already been made, and the cabin remained quiet, not tense. In the same way as before, but attentive, focused, because everyone understood that whatever came next would not just resolve the situation, it would define it, and the man remained exactly where he was, composed, patient, waiting not for permission, not for validation, but for the moment when the truth would no longer be something observed, but something acknowledged. The word decision did not dissolve into the air this time. It settled, heavier than before, because now it was no longer just something spoken. It was something recognized, something that had taken shape in the minds of everyone in that cabin. And recognition has a different kind of power, because once people see something clearly, they cannot return to how they saw it before, and the senior attendant understood that, even if she did not say it out loud, even if she tried to maintain the structure of authority that had guided her from the beginning. But structure without alignment begins to fracture, and those fractures were now visible, subtle but undeniable, in the way the officer no longer stepped forward, in the way the trainee no longer waited for instruction, in the way the passengers no longer looked away, and the man in the seat remained exactly where he had been, not as a participant in the chaos, but as its center, calm, grounded, unmoved. And that stillness was now louder than any command that had been given, because it forced everything around it to adjust, to react, to reveal itself. And he glanced down at his phone once more, not hurriedly, not as an escape, but as part of something already in motion, something that had been set into place before this moment reached its peak. And he tapped the screen once, a small movement, almost invisible, but deliberate, and then he raised it to his ear, his posture unchanged, his tone steady. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough to be heard in the silence that had taken over the cabin. "We are at the point now." And the words did not explain, they did not elaborate, but they carried meaning, because they suggested that this moment was not isolated, that it was part of something larger, something structured, something that extended beyond the cabin itself. And the officer glanced at him again, this time with a different kind of attention, not suspicion, not authority, but awareness, because now there was context forming, and context changes how actions are interpreted. And on the other end of the call a voice responded, not loud, not emotional, but efficient, composed, the kind of voice that operates within systems rather than reacting to them. And the man listened for a moment, his expression unchanged, then spoke again. "Initiate the review," he said, and the phrase landed differently than everything that had come before it, because it did not belong to the situation, it belonged to something outside it, something formal, something structured, and the senior attendant felt it immediately, that shift from internal control to external oversight, because review means evaluation, and evaluation means accountability, and accountability, once introduced, cannot be contained within a single space. It expands, it reaches beyond, it brings in others. And that was the moment the situation moved beyond the cabin, beyond the crew, beyond the immediate authority that had been exercised, and into something larger, something that would not be resolved with a simple correction or a quiet apology. And the trainee's eyes widened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition of the language, because it was not the language of a passenger, it was the language of process, of systems, of decision-making at a level she was not used to hearing in this context. And the passenger across the aisle leaned forward again, his voice low but certain. "He is not just calling someone," he said, more to himself than anyone else. But the words carried, because they aligned with what others were beginning to sense, that this was not a reaction, it was a response, something measured, something intentional. And the man ended the call as calmly as he had started it, lowering the phone without urgency, without display, and he looked back up, his gaze steady, his presence unchanged. But the room around him had shifted again, because now there was a layer that had not been there before. something unseen but felt, something that suggested this moment was already being processed somewhere else, by someone else. And the senior attendant took a breath, her composure still intact, but her position no longer secure, because control had moved beyond her reach, and she spoke again, her tone measured, careful. "Sir, we can resolve this internally," she said. But the words lacked the certainty they once carried, because internal resolution requires control, and control had already been diluted, and the man shook his head slightly, not dismissively, but definitively. "It is already being resolved," he said, and the sentence closed a door she had tried to keep open, because it removed the option of containment. It confirmed that the moment had moved beyond her ability to shape it, and the officer stepped back just slightly, not retreating, but repositioning, because his role had changed, no longer enforcement, no longer directive, but witness, and witnesses do not act. They observe, they process, and they remember, and the cabin, once filled with tension, now held something different, something quieter but more significant, anticipation, not of removal, not of escalation, but of revelation, because everyone could feel it now, that something was coming, something that would explain everything that had led to this point, something that would redefine not just the situation, but the roles within it, and the man remained. Still, composed, waiting, not for permission, not for agreement, but for the moment when the truth would no longer need to be uncovered, because it would present itself completely, and when it did, there would be no question left to ask. The moment did not rush forward. It tightened, like something unseen was closing in from all sides, and every person in that cabin felt it even if they could not name it. Because anticipation has a way of pressing against the edges of silence until silence itself becomes unbearable, and now that silence belonged to him. Not because he demanded it, but because everything else had fallen away, every excuse, every explanation, every attempt to redirect what had already been exposed, and what remained was simple, undeniable, and waiting, and the man in seat 2A did not move immediately after ending the call. He did not rush to explain, did not raise his voice, because he understood something the others were only beginning to realize, that timing is power, and the right moment does more than words ever could, and so he waited, just long enough for the weight of what had already happened to settle completely into the room, just long enough for every person there to feel the shift from uncertainty to inevitability. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that no one missed it. "My name is Darius Cole," and the sentence did not echo. It landed, firm and precise, and for a brief second it seemed like nothing changed, because names by themselves do not always carry meaning. Not until they are connected to something larger, something recognized, something that already exists in the world beyond that cabin. And the senior attendant's expression held steady for just a moment longer, as if she was searching for context, for recognition, for something that would tell her how to respond. But the delay, small as it was, revealed everything, because it showed that she did not yet understand what she was facing, and the officer glanced at the name as if testing it, as if measuring it against something in his memory, and across the aisle the passenger's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze sharpening, because something about that name felt familiar, not fully formed, but close, like a thought just out of reach, and the trainee looked between them, sensing the shift even before it fully arrived, because the tone of the moment had changed again, deeper this time, more defined, and Darius did not fill the silence that followed. He allowed it to grow, allowed the room to catch up, because revelation is not something you force, it is something you let unfold. And then, just as the weight of his name began to settle, his phone vibrated softly in his hand, a small sound, almost insignificant, but in that silence it carried, and he glanced down at it briefly before turning the screen outward, not aggressively, not theatrically, just enough for the officer to see. And on that screen was not a message, not a personal contact, but a structured interface, clean, precise, displaying information that did not belong to an ordinary passenger. And the officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he focused, reading, processing, and what he saw did not need explanation, because numbers speak in a language that does not require translation, percentages, figures, structured ownership data, and among them a line that stood out, clear and undeniable. Darius Cole, primary investment holder, Horizon Air Group. And the officer's breath slowed slightly, not from shock, but from realization, because realization is quieter, heavier, more controlled, and he straightened just a fraction, his posture shifting from uncertainty to understanding, and that shift did not go unnoticed, not by the trainee, not by the passengers, and certainly not by the senior attendant, whose composure tightened again, but this time not from control, but from recognition, because now the context had arrived, now the name had meaning, and meaning changes everything, and Darius lowered the phone slowly, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged. "I do not just fly with this airline," he said, and the sentence paused just long enough to anchor itself before he continued. "I fund it." And the words did not rise, they did not need to, because their weight was already enough, and the cabin did not react immediately, because sometimes the most significant moments are not met with noise, but with stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when reality shifts faster than people can respond, and the passenger across the aisle leaned back slightly, his expression no longer curious, but certain, because now the missing piece had been placed, now the story made sense, and the trainee's eyes widened just enough to show that she understood the scale of what had just been revealed, because this was no longer about a seat, no longer about a manifest. It was about the structure behind everything she had been trained to operate within, and the officer nodded once, slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because acknowledgement is what comes after understanding, and understanding had now fully arrived, and the senior attendant took a breath, her voice measured, careful. "Mr. Cole," she said, the title returning instinctively, because recognition changes language, it changes tone, it changes everything about how people choose to address you. And she continued, "If there has been an error, we can correct it immediately." But the words, though respectful, arrived too late, because correction implies reversal, and some moments cannot be reversed, they can only be responded to. And Darius shook his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "This was not an error," he said, and the sentence closed the door completely, because it removed the possibility of misunderstanding. It defined the moment as intentional, and intention carries consequence, and the cabin felt it. Every person there, the shift from possibility to certainty, from question to answer, and Darius looked around briefly, not to command attention, but to acknowledge the room, the witnesses, the people who had seen what had happened before they understood who he was. And then he returned his gaze forward, his voice calm, precise. "You made a decision about who belongs here," he said. And the words did not accuse, they clarified. They named the pattern without raising it to conflict, and that clarity made it heavier, because it was no longer about him alone. It was about the system, about the assumptions that operate within it, about the choices people make when they believe no one is watching. And the senior attendant remained still, her composure intact but transformed, no longer authoritative, but responsive, because the balance had shifted completely, and the officer stepped back slightly, not retreating, but creating space, because the situation had moved beyond enforcement, beyond procedure, into something that required a different kind of response, and the cabin held its breath again, not in tension, but in recognition, because everyone understood now that the moment had reached its turning point, the place where everything that had happened would finally be addressed, not as a misunderstanding, not as a delay, but as a decision that had just revealed its full weight. The word decision no longer hovered in the air as a concept. It solidified into something tangible, something that could be seen in the way the room shifted around Darius Cole, in the way posture changed, in the way tone adjusted, in the way silence itself became respectful rather than uncertain, because once identity is revealed, everything that came before it is reinterpreted, every action reconsidered, every word weighed differently, and the senior attendant felt that shift more than anyone, because the authority she had relied on just moments ago had now been replaced by something else, something higher, something that did not need to announce itself because it was already understood, and she straightened slightly, her voice measured, controlled, but no longer leading. "Mr. Cole, we were acting within protocol," she said, choosing her words carefully, because language matters when the balance of power changes, and protocol becomes a shield when accountability approaches. But Darius did not interrupt, did not challenge the statement directly. He simply listened, allowing the words to exist before responding. Because response without listening is reaction, and he was not reacting. He was concluding. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, steady, grounded. Protocol does not remove names from systems, he said, and the sentence was not loud, but it landed with precision, because it returned the focus to what had already been revealed, to the action that could not be explained away. And the officer beside him nodded slightly, not in agreement with Darius, but in acknowledgement of the fact itself, because facts do not belong to individuals, they belong to reality, and reality had already shifted, and across the aisle the passenger who had been observing spoke again, this time without hesitation. You treated him like he did not belong before you knew who he was, and the statement, simple as it was, carried more weight than any structured explanation, because it cut directly to the core of the moment, not the system, not the procedure, but the assumption, and assumptions are harder to defend because they are rarely documented, rarely justified. They exist in tone, in timing, in decisions made before facts are considered, and the senior attendant's composure tightened again, not breaking, but adjusting, because now she was no longer managing a situation, she was responding to it, and response requires a different kind of control, a different kind of awareness, and she inhaled slowly before speaking again. We had reason to question, she said, but the sentence did not complete itself with certainty, because the room was already examining that reason, already weighing it against what had been seen, what had been revealed, and the trainee lowered her gaze briefly, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding, because she had witnessed the moment before it escalated. She had seen the valid scan, she had seen the system before it was changed, and that knowledge now existed in contrast to what had been claimed. And contrast reveals truth in ways explanation cannot. And Darius remained still, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, because he did not need to push the moment forward. It was already moving, already unfolding, and he spoke again, his tone unchanged. You did not question the ticket, he said. You questioned the person. And the sentence settled into the cabin with a weight that did not require emphasis, because it aligned with what people had already begun to recognize. And recognition is powerful because it confirms what others are thinking without forcing them to say it. And the officer exhaled quietly, his stance no longer aligned with enforcement, but with understanding, and that understanding shifted his role completely, from participant to witness. And witnesses do not escalate. They observe, they process, they remember, and the senior attendant held her position, her composure intact, but transformed, because now she was no longer the authority in the room. She was part of the situation, part of what was being evaluated, and that change was subtle but absolute. And she nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging what had already been made clear, and the cabin, once tense with anticipation, now held a different kind of energy, not conflict, not confrontation, but clarity, the kind that settles into a room when the truth has already been spoken. And Darius glanced briefly toward the aisle, then back at her, his voice calm. Precise. You had time to correct it, he said, and the words did not accuse. They reflected. They pointed to the moments that had already passed, the opportunities that had already existed, and that reflection made the situation heavier, because it showed that the outcome was not inevitable, it was chosen, and choices carry consequence. And consequence does not need to be immediate to be real. And the senior attendant's gaze lowered slightly, just for a moment, not in defeat, but in recognition, because recognition is the first step toward accountability, and accountability cannot be avoided once it is acknowledged. And the officer stepped back fully now, creating space not out of retreat, but out of respect for what the moment had become, because this was no longer about removal, no longer about compliance, it was about resolution. And resolution requires clarity, not force, and the cabin remained quiet, every person present aware that they were witnessing something larger than a simple disagreement, something that extended beyond the flight, beyond the moment, into something that would carry forward. And Darius remained exactly where he was, composed, steady, not raising his voice, not escalating, because he did not need to. The moment had already reached its conclusion, and now it was simply waiting for the final piece to fall into place. The room did not erupt after the truth settled. It tightened, as if every consequence that had been delayed was now arriving all at once. not loudly, not chaotically, but with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. And Darius Cole did not move immediately. He did not rush to act, because action without timing loses its impact. And he had already allowed the moment to unfold fully. Already allowed every person in that cabin to see exactly what had happened before understanding who he was. And that order mattered, because now there was no excuse left, no misunderstanding to hide behind. Only a clear line between decision and consequence. And he reached for his phone again, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with the same measured control that had defined him from the beginning. And when he lifted it, the room did not question what he was doing anymore. It anticipated it, because the pattern had become clear. His actions were not reactions. They were steps in something already structured, already decided. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, steady, almost quiet, but every word carried weight. "Proceed," he said, and the simplicity of the command contrasted sharply with its implication, because it did not belong to the situation in front of them. It belonged to something larger, something already in motion beyond the cabin walls. And on the other end the response came immediately. Efficient, precise, the kind of voice that does not ask for clarification. Because it already understands the directive. And Darius listened for a moment, his expression unchanged, then added, "Effective now." And those two words shifted the atmosphere more than anything that had come before, because effective now does not leave room for delay. It does not allow reconsideration. It executes, and execution, when calm, is far more powerful than when emotional. And the senior attendant felt it before she fully understood it, that shift from possibility to finality. Because tone changes when something is no longer negotiable. And she stepped forward slightly, her voice controlled but edged with urgency. "Mr. Cole, we can resolve this without escalation," she said, choosing her words carefully, because escalation implies consequence, and consequence was now visible. But Darius did not look at her immediately. He allowed the call to conclude, allowed the action to finalize. And then he lowered the phone slowly, turning his gaze back to her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, and clarity does not need to be loud to be absolute. "It is already escalated," he said, and the sentence closed the space she had tried to reopen, because escalation had not just begun, it had been completed. And across the aisle the passenger exhaled quietly, the kind of breath that comes when understanding arrives all at once, because now the pieces aligned, the call, the language, the timing, all of it pointed to something beyond the moment, something that had already been triggered. And the trainee stood still, her eyes moving between Darius and the senior attendant, because she could feel it too, that shift, that final movement from observation to consequence. And the officer remained silent, his role now fully changed, no longer an enforcer, no longer a participant, but a witness to something that had moved beyond his authority entirely. And the cabin, once tense with uncertainty, now held a different kind of silence, one that was not waiting for action, but absorbing it, because action had already occurred, just not in the way they expected. And Darius spoke again, his voice even, measured. $5 billion, he said, and the number did not need context. It did not need explanation, because numbers at that scale carry their own meaning. And he continued, "That is the line of funding currently sustaining your expansion." And the words did not rise, they did not accuse, they stated. And statements at that level do not require emphasis. They require understanding. And the senior attendant's composure tightened again, not breaking, but recalibrating, because now the situation had moved beyond her role entirely, beyond the cabin, beyond the flight, into something that existed at a level she could not control. And she inhaled slowly, her voice careful, measured. "Mr. Cole, we were not aware," she began, but the sentence did not finish, because awareness was no longer the issue. And Darius shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "That is the point," he said, and the words carried a weight that extended beyond the moment, beyond the cabin, into something larger, something systemic, something that had been revealed not by his identity, but by their actions before they knew it. And the cabin felt it, every person there, the shift from individual conflict to something broader, something that spoke to patterns, to decisions made without full context, and the consequences that follow when those decisions are wrong. And Darius continued, his tone unchanged, You acted without information, and then removed it when it did not support your assumption. And the sentence did not accuse, it clarified. It mapped the sequence of events in a way that could not be denied, and the trainee lowered her gaze again, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding, because she had seen it happen. She had watched the system change, and now she understood what it meant. And the officer nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the sequence, because it aligned with what he had observed. And the senior attendant remained still, her composure intact but transformed, because now she was no longer responding as authority. She was absorbing consequence, and consequence does not need to be loud to be real. And Darius looked around the cabin briefly, not to command attention, but to acknowledge the witnesses, the people who had seen the moment unfold before they understood its scale. And then he returned his gaze forward, his voice calm. Final. The funding is being withdrawn, he said, and the sentence did not rise. It did not escalate. It concluded, and the weight of it settled into the cabin fully now, because this was no longer a possibility, no longer a warning. It was an action already in motion, already executed. And the silence that followed was different from any that had come before, not tense, not uncertain, but definitive, the kind of silence that comes after something irreversible has been set into place, and no one moved, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to redirect, only the reality of what had just been done, and the understanding that it had all begun with a decision made in a moment where no one thought it would matter. The silence did not break after the words were spoken. It settled deeper, heavier, like the cabin itself understood that something irreversible had already taken place. And for a moment no one moved, not the officer, not the trainee, not the passengers, and certainly not the senior attendant, because movement would have implied control, and control no longer existed in the way it had before. It had shifted, completely and quietly, into the hands of the man who had never raised his voice, never stood up, never demanded anything beyond what was already right in front of them. And Darius Cole remained seated, composed, his presence unchanged, but everything around him had been transformed, because now the moment was no longer about him proving anything. It was about everyone else understanding what had just been revealed. And the senior attendant finally spoke, her voice measured, careful, but no longer authoritative. Mr. Cole, we did not intend for this to escalate, she said, and the sentence carried something new, not control, not certainty, but acknowledgement, the kind that arrives when there is nothing left to defend. And Darius looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, and he responded calmly. It did not escalate, he said. It unfolded. And the distinction mattered, because escalation suggests reaction, but unfolding suggests inevitability, something that was always going to happen once the first decision was made, and the cabin absorbed that difference, because it aligned with what they had witnessed, every step, every choice, every moment where something could have been corrected but was not. And the officer shifted his stance slightly, no longer positioned as authority, but as presence, because his role had changed completely, from enforcing a directive to witnessing a consequence. And witnesses do not intervene. They remember, and the trainee stood quietly, her posture no longer tense, but grounded, because she understood now that what she had seen earlier, that small green confirmation, had been the truth from the beginning, and everything that followed had been a deviation from it. And that realization carried its own weight, not loud, not visible, but permanent. And across the aisle the passenger exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but certain. All of this started with a look, he said, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the complexity of everything that had happened, because it reduced the moment to its core, not systems, not policies, not procedures, but perception, and perception is where decisions begin. And Darius nodded slightly, not in agreement with the passenger, but in acknowledgement of the truth behind the words, and he spoke again, his tone steady, reflective. You did not remove me because of what you saw in the system, he said. You removed me because of what you thought you saw in me. And the sentence settled into the cabin with a weight that did not need emphasis, because it named the pattern. It revealed the assumption that had driven every action before his identity was known, and once named, it could not be undone, could not be hidden behind process or policy. And the senior attendant lowered her gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because recognition is what remains when justification is no longer possible. And she nodded once, slowly, accepting what had already become clear. And the cabin remained quiet, not tense, not uncertain, but aware, fully aware, of what they had just witnessed, not just an incident, but a pattern, something that extended beyond the moment, beyond the flight, into something larger, something that exists in spaces where people are judged before they are understood. And Darius glanced once more around the cabin, his gaze steady, not seeking validation, not demanding attention, but acknowledging the witnesses, the people who had seen the moment unfold before they understood its weight. And then he looked forward again, his voice calm. Final, power does not come from raising your voice, he said. It comes from knowing when you do not have to. And the words did not rise. They did not declare. They settled, like everything else he had said, grounded in certainty rather than emotion. And the officer nodded again, more clearly this time, because understanding had fully arrived. And the trainee lifted her gaze, her expression no longer uncertain, but resolved, because she had seen both sides of the moment, the assumption and the truth, and she knew which one mattered. And the senior attendant remained still for a moment longer, then stepped slightly to the side, not as a gesture of defeat, but as an acknowledgement that the space she had once controlled no longer belonged to her. And the cabin, once defined by tension, now felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, because clarity brings both. And Darius remained seated, composed, not rushing to leave, not demanding anything further, because he had already done what needed to be done, and the moment did not need to continue. It had reached its conclusion, and as the silence settled one final time, it was no longer filled with uncertainty or anticipation, but with understanding, the kind that stays long after the moment has passed, the kind that changes how people see the next person who walks into a space, and the next decision they choose to make.